Once there were two brothers who were very rich and also very wicked. Though surprisingly to some, they were faithful members of their local church, often using their wealth to gain influence. One of the brothers got sick and died, and the day before the funeral service, the surviving brother pulled the pastor aside and handed him an envelope. He said, "There's a check in the envelope that is large enough to pay off the new building. All I want you to do is to tell all the people at the funeral tomorrow that my brother was a saint. Do you think you can handle that?" Well, the pastor shook the brother's hand and said, "I will do precisely what you've asked." The pastor immediately took the check to the bank and deposited it into the church account. The next day, the preacher stood in front of the large group of people who had come for the funeral and said, "This man in the coffin was an ungodly sinner and wicked to the core. He was unfaithful to his wife and abusive to his children. He was ruthless in business and a hypocrite in the church. But compared with his brother, he was a saint." By now, I'm sure you've realized that this is a fictional tale. After all, depositing a check into a bank, what's that all about? These days, what's a bank? Our subject today is honesty, telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. A subject which is very relevant in a world where a man's word is no longer his bond. If you have a New International Version of the Bible, Matthew chapter 5 verses 33 through to 37 fall under a subtitle, Oaths, which can be a little misleading and cause us to think that these few verses aren't particularly relevant for us, but they are absolutely relevant for us today. Let's take a look at them. Verse 33. "Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'Do not break your oath, but fulfill it to the Lord, the oaths that you have made.' But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one." Well, this is our 10th study in the Sermon on the Mount. We've called the series Kingdom Manifesto, and we're discovering what it means to be citizens of God's kingdom, followers of King Jesus. And over the weeks, we've learned that God's standards and values surpass the standards that this world lives by. Jesus declared in verse 20 that unless our righteousness surpasses the righteousness of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, then we will not enter into the kingdom of heaven. And as we have observed in recent weeks, the righteousness of the religious leaders was all about externals, keeping the rules, their own man-made rules and traditions, often with the aim of making it easier to obey the Old Testament law, circumventing its true challenges. However, the righteousness that Jesus spoke about stems from an internal change. It's a change of heart, a change on the inside, which then transforms everything else on the outside. It transforms our motivations, our attitudes, our desires, our worldview, and our lifestyles. And Jesus, in this wonderful chapter, provides 6 examples of what this kingdom righteousness looks like and how it surpasses the righteousness of the Pharisees. On each occasion, Jesus uses the formula, "You have heard that it was said," referring to what the hypocritical religious leaders were teaching on how to follow God. "But I say to you," declaring what Jesus himself said about kingdom righteousness. The first thing that needs to be noted is that God did allow people to make vows in God's name in Old Testament times, as long as those vows were honoured. The third commandment provides a helpful insight into this. Exodus 20 verse 7. "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain." Now, we don't hear it so much these days, but I remember when I was growing up, the older generation telling my generation not to take the Lord's name in vain, which happened once or twice on a rugby pitch, meaning not to use the name of Jesus or Christ as a swear word. Well, as much as I dislike hearing the name of Jesus being used so flippantly, this third commandment actually has nothing at all to do with using bad language, as many people believe. Rather, it is to do with making promises or vows in God's name, but not fulfilling them, taking his name in vain. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 4 and 5. When you make a vow to God, do not delay in fulfilling it. He has no pleasure in fools. Fulfill your vow. It is better not to vow than to make a vow and not fulfill it. So, if God permitted vows or oaths being made, why did Jesus have such a problem with it? By the time of Jesus, oath-taking had fallen into disrepute. The Jews had divided up oaths into two classes, those which were absolutely binding and those which were not. Any oath that contained the name of God was absolutely binding. That is, if a man swore by God's name, he would rigidly keep his oath. But if he swore by a substitute for God, like heaven or earth or Jerusalem, or by his own head, he was free to break that oath. So evading promises and vows became a fine art in the day of Jesus. We see this again in Matthew chapter 23. Jesus uses some very strong words against the religious leaders of the day. Woe to you, blind guides! You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing. But if someone swears by the gold on the temple, he is bound by his oath. You blind fools! Which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? You also say, if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing. But if anyone swears by the gift on it, he is bound by his oath. You blind men! Which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? Therefore, he who swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. And he who swears by the temple swears by it and the one who dwells in it. And he who swears by heaven swears by God's throne and the one who sits on it. My word, Jesus, that's pretty full on. Blind guides, blind fools, blind men. And Jesus was speaking of the worst kind of blindness, prejudice and hypocrisy. One rabbi even taught that if you swear by Jerusalem, you are not bound to the vow, but if you should swear towards Jerusalem, you are bound. Oaths and vows had degenerated into a system which allowed you to get away with lying and deceit. Oaths that were originally intended to foster truthfulness were now actually promoting deceit. But the idea behind this was, if God's name was to be used, God would become a partner in the transaction. Whereas if God's name was not used directly, then God had nothing at all to do with the transaction, or so it was believed. Well, Jesus stood against this type of thinking and showed that it isn't possible to keep God out of any transaction. God is already there. It is no good swearing by the heavens as they are the throne of God, or by the earth for it's his footstool, or by Jerusalem, it's the city of God, or by a man's head, because it does not belong to him, it belongs to God. He cannot make one hair white or black. His life is God's, and there is nothing in the world that doesn't belong to God. And whether God is actually named or not, it doesn't matter. God is party to all transactions. And that was the point that Jesus was making. This kind of dividing life up into two compartments sounds very familiar. Some years back, and maybe I'm showing my age now, some people were referred to as Sunday Christians. Joe Bloggs, Mary Smith is a Sunday Christian. And it was meant really as a bit of a slur on their character, an insult. The suggestion was that Joe Bloggs was superficial in his faith, He comes to church on a Sunday and sings the songs and looks religious, but his faith doesn't go that deep. The inference is he might be a Christian on Sunday, but not on Monday to Saturday. And Jesus showed that our lives cannot be divided into compartments. That is, those parts of our lives which are in which God is involved, and other parts of our lives in which God is not involved. Theologian William Barclay wrote, "There cannot be one kind of language in the church and another kind of language in the work or sports field. There cannot be one kind of standard of conduct in church and another in the business world. The fact is, God does not need to be invited into our various compartments. He is already there throughout all of life and in every activity. He not only hears the words that are spoken in his name, but he hears every word. Every promise we make is known to him as it is made in his presence." Now that quote from William Barclay reminds me of a picture that my grandparents had in their wall, which said, "Christ is the head of this house, the unseen guest at every meal, the silent listener to every conversation." Jesus says our yes should be yes and our no should be no. He was saying that those who are kingdom citizens should live such exemplary lives that it would be quite unnecessary to furnish our words with a variety of oaths. A Christian would never need to say, "It's the honest truth." As far as I'm aware, there isn't any other sort of truth anyway, but the word honest is superfluous. As Christians, we should mean what we say and say what we mean. When I was a child, long before I ever became a follower of Jesus, my dad drummed into me that if I ever told him a lie, I would be in a lot more trouble than I would be for just the original offence. It would be double trouble. And for my many mistakes, I never tested his resolve on that point, at least as far as I can remember. Jesus is showing us that our language should be unadorned, plain, simple, straightforward, yes and no. And our simple yes or no should be more credible than someone else's swearing on the Bible or their honest to God on my child's life or on my mother's grave, as you sometimes hear people say. Sayings which really do make my toes curl. Early Christian leader Clement of Alexandria insisted that Christians must lead such a life and demonstrate such a character that no one would ever dream of asking an oath from them. I like that. But does this mean that a Christian shouldn't take an oath in a court of law, for instance? Well, some Christians believe so. The 16th century Anabaptists and also the Quakers of our own day believe so. I don't personally have a problem with that. Personally, I don't think it's necessary for us to take the words of Jesus quite so literally. I don't think that Jesus is outlawing legal vows, whether in court with a hand on the Bible or the solemn vows made in a wedding ceremony. I don't think that we need to be so pedantic in our interpretation of Jesus' words. And the reason for that, we might fall into the same trap as the Pharisees. Rather, we need to recognize that behind this teaching of Jesus is the call to honesty, transparency, and integrity. We live in a world that thinks nothing of telling lies. We don't speak so much of telling lies anymore. There are so many euphemisms used these days. Being economical with the truth, bending the truth, telling porkies, a white lie, exaggeration, spin, propaganda, embroidering the facts, embellishment. Political leaders and world leaders constantly demonstrate that they have feet of clay. Do you remember President Bill Clinton? "I tell you, I did not have sex with that woman." And when it was established that he did have a sexual relationship with Monica Lewinsky, he hid behind the word sex and how it was to be defined. "Ah, so that's what you mean. Why didn't you say so?" It reminds me of Pilate's question to Jesus, "What is truth?" And as I listen to the doctored figures of each political party, I ask myself the same question: what is truth? Can you remember the way that we used to make promises in primary school? I swear on the Bible, cross my heart and hope to die. And yet we felt justified in breaking whatever promise we'd made if we had said those words with our fingers crossed behind our backs. The crossed fingers allowed us to renege on any promise we'd made with impunity. Well, all children grow up as children do. Yet in our world of spin and exaggeration and elaboration and embellishment and hyperbole, let's not forget that we are called to be children of light, and we're called to be children of truth, as we follow the one who is referred to as the way, the truth, and the life. Citizens of the kingdom are to be different. No fingers hypothetically crossed, no empty vows. The truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And as Christians, our yes needs to be yes, and a no needs to be no. Nicky Gumbel, the architect of the Alpha Course, tells a true story of a Christian friend named Gibbo. And he worked in Selfridges in London. One day, when the owner, Gordon Selfridge, was there, the telephone rang and the caller asked to speak with Gordon Selfridge. Nicky's Christian friend passed on the message and Selfridge replied, "Tell him I'm out." Well, the Christian held up the receiver to him and said, "You tell him you're out." Gordon Selfridge took the call, but he was furious with the clerk. And later the Christian guy told Gordon Selfridge, "If I will not lie for you, then you know I'm never going to lie to you." From that moment onwards, Gordon Selfridge had the highest regards and trust for him. I love the courage of that guy. He could have got sacked, but he stood up with integrity. He wasn't going to bend the truth for convenience sake. He was a man of conscience. And our world of spin is crying out for honesty and openness and transparency and simplicity and integrity, where people will be honest and upfront with others. And if they cannot find this within the people of the kingdom, where will they find it? C.S. Lewis was such a man. The biography of C.S. Lewis tells of the suffering that he endured because he kept a promise he had made with a friend during World War I. The friend was worried about care of his wife and small daughter if he should be killed in battle. So Lewis assured him that if that were to happen, he would look after them. As the war dragged on, the man was killed. True to his word, Lewis took care of his friend's family. Yet, no matter how helpful he tried to be, the woman was ungrateful and rude and arrogant and domineering. And through it all, Lewis kept forgiving her. He refused to let her actions become an excuse to renege on his promise. His yes was yes, and his no was no. He had given his word. Period. People do not expect perfection from Christians, but they do expect upfront honesty. No room for flattery or for gossip in our language. You know the difference, don't you, between flattery and gossip? Gossip is saying behind a person's back what you would never say to their face. Flattery is saying to a person's face what you would never say behind their backs. And this teaching of Jesus is a real challenge. It's a challenge to be the real deal. Robert Redford was walking one day through a hotel lobby. A woman saw him and followed him to the elevator. "Are you the real Robert Redford?" she asked him with a great excitement. And as the doors of the elevator closed, he replied, "Only when I'm alone." Honest answer. The challenge of Jesus' words is to be authentic and to be people of integrity, where there is no difference between the Sunday church version and the Monday morning version of ourselves. What you see is what you get. There was a story based in the 18th century when King Frederick II of Prussia visited a Berlin prison One inmate after another tried to convince the monarch of his innocence. To hear their stories, they were all unjustly punished for crimes they never committed. All, that is, except one man who sat quietly in the corner. Seeing him there, the king asked the man why he was in prison. "Armed robbery, your majesty," the king asked. "Were you guilty?" "Yes, sir," said the man, without attempting to excuse his wrongdoing. King Frederick then gave the guard an order. "Release this guilty man. I don't want him corrupting all these innocent people." I have no idea if that story is true or not. Probably not. But it still offers a wonderful lesson. If you make a mistake, and I've made many and continue to make many, can I encourage you not to cover it up with a tissue of lies? Own up, confess your faults, apologize to the person that you've offended. Don't try to justify your wrongdoing. The one thing that we all have in common is that we're far from perfect. All are flawed and defective, every one of us. So let's not pretend that we're not. Be the real deal. Let me close with some questions for us all. Firstly, are we known for our integrity? Can people trust what we say completely? Do we ever renege on our promises? Do we have a reputation for being truthful? Is our word our bond, and is our promise always to be relied upon? And let our yes be yes, and let our no be no. May the Lord bless you. Do have a great week.